We know that over 70% of our immune system lives in the gut. We assimilate and break down the excess estrogen and progesterone. All of those hormones are assimilated and actually broken out, and we say goodbye when we flush the toilet. And so immune system function has many wheels, but I look at stressing the body so you don't have to be emotionally stressed. It's not like you're having to have a life event to trip your immune system. The actual stressors of the body of kind of pushing that accelerator on hours on the go, lack of rest in between. It's a really big detoxifier when we sleep, but it also is a way that we are operating in removing those hormones that we need and making the hormones that we need, the melatonin, the serotonin as well, that helps induce sleep.
When we use the term bio-individuality, and for listeners that are hearing me sound like a frog, I am recovering from an upper respiratory infection. Happy to say I am completely free of COVID, but I just want to preemptively say I sound like I've been a 50-year pack year smoker, but I am improving. I just am now left with laryngitis. Let's unpack what bio-individuality represents, because people are familiarized hearing me use that term quite a bit. But I know in your work with patients as well, this is a huge point of contention, because the kind of mainstream medicine narrative is that there's a one-size-fits-all philosophy, and you and I both recognize and honor the power of being our own individuals.
Absolutely. If we look to the spectrum of this one-size-fits-all, which has been said a lot, people now understand that one size doesn't fit all, but we don't understand how granular it is necessary that we get to really hit the optimal state of health for that individual. And that's why with my approach, Cynthia, and you know this very well, is we match the genetics and those potentialities with the current state of health. And women are so dynamic, not only from month to month, but from year to year. And then also just in terms of managing and juggling so much in our lives. And so looking to that through that bio-individualized lens that's overlaid with our genetic potentiality for how we process hormones, how we process catecholamines and neurotransmitters, how we manage our insulin is super important for women, and how we manage our protein and sulfur and oxalate metabolism, because that then plays in hormonal disruption in particular is really central to orchestrating a very nuanced and elegant plan, but it's simple in its application. And as you know, your family knows our practice very well, is that once you get into the rhythm of understanding it, when you get out of balance, you're like, oh, okay, I did this, and it may have affected my metabolic pathway that way. And so again, once we understand it, then we're educated and we're not afraid of, I have no idea why this is happening. And we fall further down the rabbit hole, because now we're in a state of fear and uncertainty.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much more to hormones than trying to control them. I think that's kind of the traditional medical narrative, of which, that's where my training began. And when we thought about hormones, they were in buckets, that there was no intercommunication between hormones and neurotransmitters and organs. It was just, you're in a bucket. We're going to talk about progesterone in one bucket, and estradiol in another, and testosterone in another, and insulin and cortisol. And yet we now really understand that it's all a complex interrelationship between all of these hormones and neurotransmitters. And as you mentioned, whether or not we can metabolize and break down certain types of food compounds. And so let's really start with what makes women unique in terms of their hormonal makeup, and the recognition that women that are still very fertile and still cycling every month are a little bit different than women who are no longer cycling, no longer in their reproductive years.
Absolutely. So women are beautifully complex and elegant at the same time. And so what makes us unique is that we have to look at our body's ability. We look at methylation, which that is also a big buzzword in the world of functional medicine, and how we methylate determines our genetic expression. That's why DNA methylation is super critical, but how we methylate also determines our body's ability to manage and metabolize hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, insulin, catecholamines of serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and also how to synthesize protein, which is necessary also for amino acid utilization, which gets to then a downstream impact on how we manage glucose regulation. And so we really have to look at, am I methylating? Am I breaking down that estrogen? We have to look at the gut. If we're in a dysbiotic gut, there's an enzyme that's produced called beta-glucuronidase. It took me about 3 months to say that correctly. But when that enzyme is elevated, then we're actually creating what I call an estrogen spin cycle. So the liver sends the excess estrogen to be excreted by the gut. The gut says, no, I can't do it. It sends it to the lymph. The lymph sends it back to the liver. We get fluffy. We get estrogen dominant. We get cystic acne. We can even become polycystic. Our thyroid starts going sideways. We get depressed because estrogen and serotonin compete on the cells for the same receptor sites. So just that one little dysbiotic gut can set off this cascade of what I've just said. And then the doctors are dumbfounded because what they're saying, well, your absolute estrogen numbers are normal, so let's give you more estrogen. Well, that's absolutely the last thing you want to do because you're already under an estrogen burden. And they give you more estrogen because your periods are dysregulated and you're starting to get a little fluffy, and you're also starting to get depressed, right? So estrogen is the go-to, even if it's if it's compounded, and even if it's the better form of estrogen. As you know, I rarely tell women that hormone therapy is the answer to hormone dysregulation.
Well, and I think it also speaks to the fact that we're dealing with a symptom in traditional allopathic medicine. We're dealing with a symptom as opposed to looking upstream or downstream. And I think a lot of your work, and certainly I feel like I know it now over the last several years, is really a reflection of looking outside the box, of really thinking very critically at all of the interrelationships that you kind of alluded to. Now, dysbiosis, I affectionately refer to as weeds in the garden. When I'm trying to explain it to patients that, there are good, healthy, bacteria that belong in the gut microbiome. And then we have weeds in the garden, to really identify that there are things that they're not benefiting us. And in fact, in some instances, they can be quite harmful. What do you feel like are some of the major contributors to the development of dysbiosis in your patient population?
So we call them getting bullies in the sandbox, right? So we have this UN, everybody lives together happily. We all get a seat at the table because there are many more organisms than there are cells in our body. It's only 43% us. The rest is not us. It's bacteria, it's viruses, it's parasitic organisms, they're fungal organisms. But as long as everybody's happy, then no, they leave us alone. Stress is a huge inducer of becoming bullies in the sandbox, because we know stress, I call it a fire starter. It helps to feed these guys. So now they were all being happily playing, and now they're being fed. And now some of them like to feed on sugar. See, they don't like it at all. My earbud just fell out. So once they're fed, then they become overgrown, like they become weeds, right? So our polished and manicured garden is now weedy. When that happens, Candida is really a big bug. I call it the beast of yeast. It is a fungal organism. Strep is also a big problem, and we don't even have to have active strep. It could be triggered by Candida setting off an autoantibody of strep. So why is Candida such a beast? Well, we know that 90% of serotonin and 50% of dopamine is made in our gut. When the beast of yeast is in play, that's going to be dysregulated. When Candida is become a weed, as you say, it's going to start an estrogen dominant cycle. When Candida becomes a weed, the enzymes there, like the beta-glucuronidase, are going to become elevated, further creating an estrogen burden. When the weeds are out of control, the minerals such as iodine and selenium and copper and iron and zinc, which are so necessary for the making of thyroid hormones, because some thyroid hormones are actually made in the gut, they're being pushed out. So now we're demineralized. We have a bully in the sandbox. Our serotonin is being pushed down. Our dopamine is being pushed down. We're now depressed. We're not making our thyroid hormones. So now we're metabolically out of alignment. We're recycling estrogen. So now our liver is backed up. So now we're fat malabsorbed. So now once our liver is backed up, now insulin is becoming a problem. So you look at this beautiful, elegant, like domino effect, just by a stress event alone that just set off this firestorm of complete dysregulation of hormones, mineralization, metabolic function, organ dysfunction. It's quite remarkable how one little thing can have such a huge impact.
Well, and I think that there's not enough focus. I know in my traditional kind of allopathic training, we talk about stress like it's a bucket. Again, back to the bucket methodology of, here's stress and this is how you deal with stress. But really what we're focusing on are these symptoms, but the acknowledgement that this is all interrelated. I would also add, when I'm working with women, and the GI map is the test that I use where I can see all that dysbiosis. And interestingly enough, women north of 35 almost consistently have a tremendous amount of dysbiosis. And depending how metabolically healthy they are, and the acknowledgement that the bulk of the population is now largely metabolically unhealthy,
Yes.
I see more and more and more of the dysbiosis. And I always say it's almost as if it's the canary in the coal mine. It's just letting us know there's a whole lot more that's going on underneath all that. So the woman that comes to you that is fat malabsorbed, needs liver detoxification support, is depressed, is feeling fluffy, which fluffy, by the way, is the most beautiful way of describing how many women feel when their hormones aren't properly balanced. It's like you just don't feel right. And it's a non-technical terminology, but any woman who's ever felt this way knows you don't feel 100%. You're not feeling confident. God forbid someone asks you to get into a bathing suit or do anything like that. You're not going to feel like you're in the best position. So when you're counseling women, talking women about this, do you find that women that are already on, for example, synthetic hormones, bioidentical hormones, that this just exacerbates this entire situation, I would imagine?
Absolutely. And that's really interesting that you say that most women that you see over 35 are metabolically dysbiotic. And whoops, I'm just having a hard time with these little earbuds today. So I think, Cynthia, the reason why, a great reason, is because many of us have been on hormones, mostly estrogen, which is going to, by its own nature, disrupt the gut microbiome. So that's really fascinating. And now we're told we're going into menopause. And so, yes, estrogen is going to drop as an absolute number, but so is progesterone. And typically the first thing to be given is estrogen, because they say, well, you're dropping estrogen. But let's look at the difference between and the balance between estrogen and progesterone. And are you still estrogen dominant because your progesterone has fallen much faster than the estrogen? And so I do counsel many women. We work a lot with infertility. We work a lot with menopause and depression and anxiety that comes with it. We work a lot with thyroid dysfunction. We work a lot with the tangential weight, the fluffy, right, as a result of a metabolic dysfunction that has resulted. So when women come into my practice, we really first look at what are your genetic tendencies. If you have that MTHFR, C677T gene polymorphism, like you and I share, all right? So we're women that recycle estrogen. I didn't know it at the time, but when I was trying to conceive, I had multiple miscarriages. Why? Because I was estrogen dominant. And I also had a very rigorous corporate career. I traveled all the time. And one of the things that many women don't know is when we are pushing cortisol, which is a stress hormone, we actually eat progesterone. So I call it the progesterone steal. So progesterone is stolen to make cortisol, because we are the ever ready bunnies that have to get on that plane and then keep it going and then come home and do all the things that we women do. And so I had 4 miscarriages, not understanding that I was so estrogen dominant. We didn't have genetics at the time. And then I had to be on bed rest for 10 weeks with each of my children, again, because my progesterone was so low. In retrospect, I understand that now. And also I was under great stress during the pregnancies. So we really have to look at genetically, how are we, right? Do I have that MTHFR gene? Do I also have the COMT gene, which not only looks to regulating our serotonin and dopamine, which estrogen dysregulates, but it also goes to high estrogen. So now I've got two markers that are in the genetic model or wheel of me that makes me more likely to be estrogen dominant. And so we look at MTHFR, we look at COMT, then we also look at genes that create oxalates. Oxalates tend to, like spinach and almond, and you and I know that, and you were for a while there, you weren't eating those when you shared publicly about your situation when your gut was off, which then caused other things. And so those tend to build mold. Mold is a fungus, and fungus and estrogen feeds on mold. So then here we are again, feeding that estrogen imbalance. And so looking at the genes of mold, the genes of methylation, the genes of insulin, there's INSR gene, there's a GAD gene. And so how is that playing? Because insulin is called the fat storage hormone. And if we're trying to be keto in an environment where we have all of these genetic tendencies that make us unable or less robust in fat metabolism, what are hormones? They're fat soluble. So our liver is going to be backed up. And that's when we truly get fluffy, because we can't break down the foods that are high in fat. And we're really poking the bear from a detoxification perspective and really backing up that liver, making hormones much more unable to be processed. So more is not better. Many doctors, they say, just take more estrogen. Let's add a little testosterone. Let's add a little progesterone. And your liver's going, stop. I can't break it down. And I'm getting fluffy. And now it's going into my lymph. And because the brain is made up of over 60% of fat, now we can't even think anymore because we're foggy headed. So we have to look at all of that. And we look at it in terms of where you are, and looking at your genetics, looking at your estrogen. We do applied kinesiology. And you've witnessed it personally, how in real time it gives us such beautiful feedback on, can you eat that almond butter? Can you have that avocado, even though it pulls estrogen, because you're so fat malabsorbed right now? So we look at the foods also that compare and contain certain constituents that can either help you or hurt you.
So much good information. Do you have specific genetic testing that you like to work with? If you are concerned that someone has the MTHFR, SNP or COMT, do you refer, is there a particular test that you have a preference for?
Well, interestingly enough, because when we look at hormones, hormones are clearly linked to mood and depression and anxiety. So for your the medical practitioners out there in the listening audience, there are two tests called GeneSight and GenoMind. Those are both used for actually trying to see what pharmacotropics or SSRIs and SNRIs and anti-anxiety and so forth meet your genetic blueprinting. And I use it also to say, do you have that? Because it looks at MTHFR, it looks at COMT, it looks at phase 1 liver detoxification, how well you can process compounds and chemicals and pharmaceuticals, right? So that's a great one. It is by order, but what I use in our naturopath here who analyzes the polymorphisms, we either use 23andMe and or our ancestry.com, and then I kind of run it through the Cochrane Method, which really kind of layers another element of this symphony and dance that we look at. But we find those to be extremely helpful. In office, if you don't have those tests, we test this genetic SNPs as well, if you will, through muscle testing to see if there's an imbalance. So we do test that in-house. It won't be a direct output because dirty genes can happen according to Ben Lynch. So even if you don't have that variance in the gene, you could be expressing it as you may. But the Ancestry, the 23andMe, and those other two that I mentioned are very good in giving us a really good foundation for saying, how might I react in the presence of XYZ?
I think that's really valuable because I'm sure there are people listening, either clinicians or the lay public, that are wondering, how can I find this information out? For full disclosure, probably 10 plus years ago, my older cousin, who's like a dear sister to me, who's an OBGYN, she dove down that genetic rabbit hole and came to me and said, listen, if I've got 2 copies, you probably have at least 1. And so it turns out I am homozygous from THFR for A677T. And here's the important thing for everyone to understand. Just because you have it doesn't mean that you have to take methylated vitamins immediately. You have to dive down that rabbit hole, because what ended up happening to another cousin who is related to my older cousin, she ended up getting very sick because all of a sudden she started taking this MTHFR protocol. And much to your point, you know, bioindividuality rules, you can have these genetic susceptibilities, but you may not be expressing them. And I think actually taking all of those supplements actually turned things on for her that actually made her, she went to the hospital. She was actually
Wow.
so sick. So
Wow.
recognizing you really want to work with someone that understands the nuances, because it really is very nuanced. And I love that you have so many options in terms of looking at genetic markers and looking at the susceptibility of the individual, because I think that's so, so important. And one other thing that I think is really important, you know, there may be terms that you're hearing you've never heard of before. Oxalates. Oxalates are something I really probably didn't think much about until after my hospitalization. And no matter what I ate, I could only eat meat. I could eat meat and I did fine. Anything that had fiber, and certainly not an oxalate, would actually drive more inflammation in the gut. So let's talk a little bit about what oxalates are for the benefits of people that may not be familiarized with this. But I will affectionately start the conversation with killer kale.
Killer kale. Yes, killer kale is both an oxalate and a sulfur compound. So why have oxalates, why have they been so shrouded in as being healthy? And why have these compounds that contain oxalates, why are they become now such villains, such as killer kale?
Mhm.
Well, I believe in the work of Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's a wonderful top researcher at MIT and I believe biochemist, has elucidated the fact that glyphosate, which is the active form found in Roundup, it's a pesticide, is actually having a massive deleterious effect on our macrobiome, right? So that's our food, our soil, and so forth. And what is happening to our microbiome and then the metabolic pathways is that glyphosate has interrupted the body's ability, back to the dysbiotic gut, back to the weeds versus the flowers, is that it's interrupted the body's ability to create the probiotics, those good guys, that used to be able to dismantle the oxalates. So what are oxalates? Oxalates are found in plants and beans and nuts and seeds and certain fruits that they act as a protective mechanism to the plant. But the plant itself may have other wonderful properties, like spinach has iron and strawberries have vitamin C and killer kale has phytonutrients. However, when our gut can no longer manage the dismantling of that protective covering, then these oxalates can actually contribute to the feeding of candida, because now they're helping to feed mold. They also help to create crystals, which actually cut the gut, right? Because they're little crystals. They're also can be found to aggregate in the kidney and in the gallbladder, because 85% of gallstones and kidney stones are calcium oxalates, right? And most importantly, which is very little spoken about, is oxalates have been linked to myocardial infarction, heart attack, folks, because it creates these this arteriosclerosis, creating plaque. So I'm here to tell you, it's not necessarily the cholesterol that may be the problem. Cholesterol actually has very positive properties. We have to look at the lipoprotein structure of cholesterol to see if it's sticky or if it's not. But absolute cholesterol numbers is a way old school way of finding out, do you have heart risk? Look at the oxalate burden, look at your genetics. Do you have arthritis? Are you crystallizing? That may be more of an issue than what might seem to be a high cholesterol. Then you get put on a statin, and that statin will more than likely affect your kidney. That's why people get cramps, and it's been shown to dysregulate insulin, which is again much more of an inflammatory agent to the heart than absolute cholesterol. So it's a big thing. And so we eat and killer kale, and spinach and almonds and blueberries and black beans, all berries except for cherries and black beans, because we've been told, hey, these are amazing. They have phytonutrients. They're going to help, help your gut. They're going to be liver detoxifiers. This is a true story. I had a kale smoothie once, didn't understand it, that before killer kale, I knew that killer kale was such a problem for me. I had to stop on the road and get off the road because I could not think, Cynthia. It also impacts, those oxalates impact that dopamine and serotonin. And I got very dizzy. I got completely disoriented. I'm like, I just had a happy smoothie. But through my ever emerging research, I'm like, holy moly, this is what's happening. And these oxalates can also turn on pathogenic loads, which can be really problematic, as we just spoke to earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting because friends of mine that are aware of these plant-based compounds, we were talking about how we know we've had too much oxalates. And for me, my tell, I don't get brain fog or get dizzy. I will get loose stools. And so that's my tell. That's how I instantaneously know. And for anyone that is not familiar, it's now almost 3 years ago, I was hospitalized for 13 days, spent almost 9 months being carnivore because anytime I introduced fiber and certainly oxalates, it would really exacerbate my symptoms. But for me, my tell is two things. I get loose stools and I will get plantar fasciitis pain in 1 foot. 1 foot, not both feet, 1 foot. And so I find it fascinating that it creates that much inflammation in the body, that it's my tell. But I think for you and I, and probably some of the listeners too, they're very attuned to how their bodies feel. Like they lean in when something doesn't feel right, and they try to say, okay, what could be exacerbating this symptom? And so also important to just mention there are other types of plant-based compounds, things like tannins, saponins. Oxalates is probably a more popular thing. And I think for a lot of people that are low carb, keto, gluten-free, a lot of almond flour, a lot of almonds in your life, I encourage you to think outside the almond-centric world. And the one thing I came to find out when I took this amazing break from eating higher oxalate foods is that I really didn't like almonds. That's what I was stunned by. I was like, I had no idea how much I preferred, as you suggested, salted macadamia nuts. Make me very happy. And they're low carb too.
Yeah, they are. And interestingly enough, almonds are one of the highest oxalate load of the plant kingdom. Almonds, spinach, and black beans carry the highest oxalate burden. So similar to me, when I was trying to eat almonds and my gut was always a wreck. And now when I eat, my tipping point now is when I have too many oxalates, I feel like I have crystals on the bottoms of my feet. So I'm really becoming little, and it hurts to walk. So I know I better get off those blackberries and really tune it down. Now, to your listening audience, that's not to say you will never have a berry or you will never have spinach. It's just doing that beautiful dance and also being empowered and in alignment with, okay, I'm not afraid and I'm not going to freak out. Oh yeah, I hit that little tipping point. Let me just back off a little bit. And you do, and within a few days, because the body's very forgiving when we can read it and really understand what it's trying to tell us, you'll be fine. But you can't do it over time because you won't be fine.
Absolutely. Now, there's a terminology that you used earlier in our conversation about liver detoxification. So unfortunately, I feel like the word detox or detoxification has really become trendy. People don't really understand that our body is designed ideally to be able to detoxify on its own, but it's our modern day lifestyles, our modern day nutrition, our modern day exposure to toxins and our personal care products, nutrition, and our environment that can offset this detoxification process. So can we touch on this, because this is an area where I feel like I get a lot of questions. Women genuinely want to do all they can to support their bodies as naturally as possible, but sometimes we need help from the outside world.
Absolutely. So detoxification has 2 phases. Liver detoxification has phase 1, and this is what I call spring cleaning. This is where it gets messy before we put it back in the drawers, right? So in this phase 1, we're creating this, it's called intermediary metabolites that kind of messes things up. We kind of put it out there. So then the 6 phases of phase 2 liver detoxification can wipe it down, take it out, and everybody's happy. But again, back to your genetic predispositions, there are certain constituents in foods and drugs and even supplements that will slow that phase one. And if you're slow, you are in trouble. And one of the biggest and largest touted antioxidants in the marketplace today, and I say buyer beware, and this is where you need to know your genes, is turmeric and curcumin, highly touted as a master antioxidant. Well, hey, guess what, folks? If you have that CYP2D6, just like I do, and boy, these little guys are having trouble today, then it can slow your phase one liver detoxification by up to 50%. And Cynthia, I had a woman who had come to see me for the first time, and she says, I don't understand what's happening. Over 5 weeks, I've gained 15 pounds. I'm like, you're super fluff, right? So her liver and her you could see the edema in her hands, in her feet, in her face, so fluffed. What we were able to figure out is she had that CYP2D6 and she was drinking turmeric tea 3 times a day. That one tea alone had backed up her liver, which backed up her lymph, which made her hypothyroid and ruined her periods. So it's really interesting how, so turmeric, curcumin, if you have another gene SNP in that phase one liver detoxification, grapefruit could be a problem. That's why they say don't take your supplement or your pharmaceuticals with grapefruit. Why? Well, some people can do it because they don't have that gene, but we don't get that granular in medicine. But if you do, it can slow that pharmaceutical won't be metabolized by 1/3. So it just all of a sudden got stronger. And that's why we have these black box warnings on certain pharmaceuticals that say, hey, if you do this, that can happen. Well, I believe that what's happened is the scientists have said, look, if you have these genetic polymorphisms, that could be a black box. What I hope one day, Cynthia, is that when they are labeled, that they will say, if you have this genetic SNP, do not take this, right? So you don't even have to go through the experiment of that problem, which potentially could be lethal. And so that's phase one.
So question for you. So the young woman that you're mentioning that was drinking that turmeric tea 3 times a day, with her polymorphisms and SNPs, could she have had it once or twice a week? So I'm wondering if it's the frequency with which she was consuming it that caused that tipping point for her in terms of, well, in terms of things not working efficiently, but her phase one liver detoxification being so thrown off.
Right. So I think it's all the organization and the orchestration of what else she's taking. So with zinc, with vitamin C, those upregulate phase one liver detoxification. So it's a push-pull. So she could have drank that 1 or twice a week if she was having these other elements that was helping to counterbalance that slowing of that detoxification. But also if she was taking glutathione, which also slows phase one and is an impairment in sulfur processing, then you were getting a 1-2 punch. Glutathione also touted as a wonderful antioxidant, but not for those of us that have impaired phase one like me and or impaired sulfur processing like me. So it really depends on what counterbalances are you adding to your world to allow you to manage these things. Like, for example, zinc is phenomenal for me because I am such a slow phase one. Since I've started taking, and I love zinc carnosine, I take it every day, it has really helped my liver detoxification, and it has really helped my insulin balancing and glucose balancing because it's really fire started that phase one where I'm detoxifying. That means that I'm better utilizing my insulin because it has to be managed through the liver. So it is really this beautiful dance, and that's why practitioners like you and I having this information is super valuable because we're giving our clients, patients, all that they need to understand this dance on how they should best support detoxification. So it's really, really important. And then methylation in phase two, as we've talked about, is just like uber king. Methylation and sulfation and amino acid conjugation. I think those are the big 3 in phase two liver detoxification. And to your point about your relative, is that just because you have the MTHFR gene doesn't mean that you should take a lot of B vitamins. This is where you look at the orchestration of what other other gene SNPs do you have that can actually make you overmethylate? So if you do B12, it's actually a buzzy bee. So I say, do you have a helper bee or a buzzy bee? And if you're taking a lot of B vitamins, you have a lot of other genes that can be overmethylators, then that B12 becomes buzzy. Don't take B12, take choline instead. That helps to manage that out. And so you can find other ways to methylate without a ton of B or folate.
Well, I think the other thing that's really fascinating, and I know when I was healing from my hospitalization, I craved meat and I craved oranges and I craved peppers. And I remember our conversation, you were saying, you know, this makes complete sense. And I craved eggs. That was the other thing. And it was like the choline and the vitamin C and like all the things, because I was also anemic.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really fascinating that our body oftentimes will crave the types of vitamins, minerals, et cetera, that we need, but we sometimes don't acknowledge that. And I think there's a lot of focus on sugar cravings and salt cravings, which can also be indicative of imbalances in the body. When I crave salt, I know my adrenals need more support. I always say, if I want a chip or I'm craving salty food, there's something that's definitely off for sure. So there's one more phase to detoxification that occurs in the gut. And this kind of comes back to our original conversation, talking about dysbiosis, the weeds in the garden. So for many, many women that don't have good, properly functioning detoxification pathways, if they're not properly breaking down estrogen, here's the really funny thing. They'll say, but I have a bowel movement every day. And I always say, that's great. But even if you're having a bowel movement every day, you may not be breaking down and excreting the excess estrogen. And most, if not all women that at least I come across, even in menopause, even in perimenopause, are estrogen dominant. They can't get rid of this extra estrogen. How do you, like, what is your traditional kind of focus or methodology dealing with that?
Great question. And again, as we've talked about, yeah, that estrogen spin cycle, especially with that dysbiotic gut and the beta-glucuronidase that is elevated. So it depends. Calcium D-glucarate is really wonderful. So calcium D-glucarate is an aromatase inhibitor. It helps to break down that estrogen. The reason why I like calcium D-glucarate is in my studies, it also has shown that it can lower LDL cholesterol by up to 29%. So why is that important? Because cholesterol, estrogen, and thyroid are linked. We see a lot of, when I see elevated triglycerides, I look to the thyroid. And then I also, when I see elevated TSH, I look to the liver to see if triglycerides are elevated. They're simpatico in terms of another key piece of information that many doctors miss. So calcium D-glucarate can also manage all of that. If you have beta-glucuronidase, then we have an elevated enzyme, then we may need something to manage the dysbiosis. I really like mastic gum. It's a tree resin. It's really great for H. pylori, which also can dysregulate a bacterial balance. I love caprin, which is wonderful for candida. And so when we lower candida, we will also help regulate estrogen. There's something called DIM, which has indole 3-carbinol that really helps to pull estrogen. However, cautionary, if you're hypothyroid and have goitrogens, DIM is made from cruciferous vegetables. Crucifers are goitrogens, so we have to look at that nuance. Another thing we might need is, hey, we need a little progesterone. Instead of trying to pull estrogen, let's just manage it with a little progesterone. But again, rarely do I say go to bioidentical or actually pharmaceutical progesterone and progestin, because those are like bazookas. Instead, why don't we do a little bit of chaste tree berry or vitex, right? Which actually will bring up natural progesterone levels. And so do we actually need to manage the cortisol that's making estrogen, because it's feeding cortisol, is that dirty cupcake, that adrenaline dirty cupcake cortisol that's actually feeding the candida, that's actually making the estrogen too high. So let's just look at the adrenals. Let's give ourselves a little bit of ashwagandha or astragalus or some magnesium or some salt, or again, progesterone, because we get that progesterone steal when we're making too much cortisol. So many ways to skin this little kitty. But those are really good things to look at. Again, looking at the granularity of you.
No, I think it's really important, and it's so helpful even for me and for listeners. They know I take copious notes. I do copious amounts of preparation, and I literally I'm like every square inch of this piece of paper in front of me, because I do my intros after we record. I'm like, there will be no more space. Everything is going to be covered because I'm loving all of the Terryisms, the dirty cupcake and, fluffy. I mean, all of these things really they make it so much easier to understand for people that are not medical professionals, these kind of potentially intangible kinds of concepts. So helpful. And, on so many levels, I think that we really do ourselves a disservice when we assume that everything needs to be, the need flex reaction is that everything needs to be a prescription medication. And so there really are pharmaceutical grade supplements that can be profoundly impactful for patients. Now, let's pivot a little bit. And I think given the fact I've got this gravelly voice, the role of and function of the immune system is very timely for about 1,000 different reasons. Obviously, I know why I got sick. It was not enough sleep, husband traveling, not getting to bed on time because I'm picking up teenagers from sports. Granted that these are all choices I made. However, when we're talking about the role of hormones and immune function, I think this is particularly relevant and certainly timely.
Absolutely. So we know that over 70% of our immune system lives in the gut. So back to the gut. We got to start in the gut because so many hormones are assimilated and made in the gut. A lot of thyroid hormones are made in the gut. We assimilate and break down the excess estrogen and progesterone. All of those hormones are assimilated and actually broken out, and we say goodbye when we flush the toilet. And so immune system function has many wheels, but I look at stressing the body so you don't have to be emotionally stressed. It's not like you're having to have a life event to trip your immune system. The actual stressors of the body of kind of pushing that accelerator on hours on the go, lack of rest in between, the not enough sleep because we break and make hormones during sleep hours. So it's a really big detoxifier when we sleep, but it also is a way that we are operating in removing those hormones that we need and making the hormones that we need, the melatonin, the serotonin as well, that helps induce sleep. So clearly sleep is super important, and the quality of sleep is super important. That's why I have an Oura ring. I look at my heart rate variability. I look at my restful sleep. Where, did I have REM? Did I have deep sleep? What was my heart rate? And so I look to that. And then I take things at night to help us, like magnesium. You and I both love magnesium. We love my stress mover. I take it every night. GABA is super important as a neurotransmitter that calms, but it also helps regulate so many hormones. So to the immune system, back to zinc. Zinc has been such a champion in modulating immune system function because it has so many hormone downstream impacts. It helps with insulin. It helps with thyroid function. Zinc carnosine in particular helps manage the lining of the gut. So that's a big winner. We also like to look at really supporting the adrenals. The adrenals they're the glands that produce the natural corticosteroids of epinephrine and cortisol. When we use them appropriately, they are amazing because they lower the inflammatory response. When we whack out our adrenals, that anti-inflammatory response isn't there. What is the fire starter for getting sick? Inflammation, right? So looking to really loving those adrenals. If you've had a rough day, a long day, put a little heat on those adrenals, which sit like right on top of your kidney. So if you put your hands on your waist, your second and third finger will find your adrenals. A little heat on the adrenals. A little bit of holy basil tea is actually quite wonderful for adrenal function. Rose tea, these calmatives, a little L-theanine, which helps modulate that dopamine. So we have taurine, which really helps with dopamine and serotonin. If you need that melatonin, I know I saw one of your Instagrams where you have this like melatonin, really big boy that says, oh my gosh, this is really helping me sleep. So we also have to look at melatonin because those of us that have the MAOA polymorphism, if you take melatonin, you'll be up all night. So again, looking at the genetic granularity of you and if that gene is expressed. So really eating the right foods that's going to create a wonderful gut environment And again, if we have a lot of bullies in the sandbox, a lot of probiotics may not be good for you. Or if you have high histamine, we have to look at histamine from an inflammatory response. So if we're having high histamine and we're trying to overpopulate the gut with probiotics, that could be a problem. And it's creating more of a histamine response. So taking manganese, which lowers histamine, or taking quercetin with bromelain, which is wonderful antihistamine bioflavonoid, helps seal the tight junctions of the gut, also helps move zinc into our cells. So things like that. Vitamin C is an antioxidant, a phase 1 liver upregulator, an adrenal supporter. So things like zinc, quercetin, vitamin C, vitamin D. We're now heading into the winter months. We lose vitamin D. Vitamin D also linked to hormone health. Guys, it is a pre-hormone. D is a pre-hormone. It helps manage cholesterol. It helps with insulin. It helps with thyroid. Helps with immune system. It's important.
No, it really is. And it's interesting, on my desk, which of course viewers can't see this, I have mixed ascorbates, because I was talking about this today, as well as capsules of vitamin C, because I was talking in the context of, making sure that you are stocked up for what products are going to be beneficial to preemptively try to stay healthy throughout the winter. I do have melatonin on my desk, and what you saw on my Insta stories today was a colleague had mentioned a product called the Sandman.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because I'm always fascinated with trying new things, I bought said Sandman. Their per-rectal suppository is a super physiologic melatonin. I doubled my deep sleep on 200 milligrams of melatonin. And this is what's important. We make less melatonin as we get older. That's a normal function of aging. We also don't recognize that melatonin is more than a hormone. It's not just in the hormone bucket, it's a master antioxidant. And so I won't use this every night, of course, but it was fascinating to me when I took it. And that was my concern was, oh my gosh, what if I am one of those people who gets stimulated with that much melatonin? Thankfully, I did not. I fell asleep effortlessly. But it was amazing to kind of see the net impact on my sleep quality. And here's the other thing. What I understand about melatonin is people can take larger doses for a short duration of time. Maybe they're trying to replenish what should have been there. But it's also more important that we're mitigating and ensuring that we are properly regulating the secretion of melatonin. This is a good example. We are recording at almost 5:30 at night.
Yes.
I've got artificial light on. It's getting dusk outside. I'm not wearing blue blockers, but as soon as we are done, I will make sure I put those on so that I'm not going to have an adverse impact on my sleep. And I love that you touched on this complex interrelationship between all of these hormones and neurotransmitters. There are a lot of connections that you make in your work that were so new for me that every time I would meet with Teri, I was taking notes. And just like that, today I'm taking notes because there's so many interconnections that we just don't learn about. Now, one thing that I do want to touch on, we talked about the role of the gut health on how we metabolize estrogen, how it impacts immune health. We talked a little bit about the net impact of our exposure to pesticides and what that can do to the gut microbiome and also small intestinal hyperpermeability. What is one thing that we haven't touched on that you think is really helpful or would be very helpful for listeners to consider when they're making nutritional choices? Because let me back up for 1 second. One thing that you're known for is encouraging people to consume, a Wildatarian lifestyle. This is a term that you have coined, and certainly working with you personally and professionally, we have been trying different types of protein. So bison is now a favorite, wild boar, ostrich, we're not sure about. We're kind of, I'm not sure that will be our first choice, but trying different types of proteins as opposed to just the kind of conventional chicken, pork, beef, if we want to say those are the most conventional options that are out there, because most, if not all of us, are not consuming enough protein. We consume far too many processed carbs, not enough of the right kind of fats, and certainly insufficient quality types of protein.
Great question. And indeed, you and I and Gabrielle Lyon, we all are very pro, as Dave Asprey is very pro protein, because we do need that. Protein is the building block of life. And it's really interesting, Cynthia, that in order to make one strand of muscle fiber, we have to break down protein and recombine them into 5,300 amino acids to make one strand of muscle. If you are plant-based, folks, that takes a whole heck of a lot of work to put together 5,300 hemoglobin, collagen, and muscle are one of the largest proteins that our body needs. One of my signature discoveries, which I'm really proud of, is that I found through my clinical, empirical, and anecdotal information through my clients, but also through literature that was out there as a result of trying to find a solution to an end-stage cancer client, is that the proteins that we are eating, the domesticated animal protein, in particular chicken, which has many studies around it, and then beef, pork, and turkey, domesticated animal meat contains these, in many cases, indigestible, truncated, can't be broken down, proteins by the name of amyloids. And we know about the amyloids of Alzheimer's, but we also are seeing that amyloids are related to cancer. It's related to kidney disease, related to autoimmunity, related to dementia, related to heart disease. It's a big thing that we have yet to elucidate as a contributor to chronic illness in the US. And so where did these truncated protein structures, or why did they show up? Well, the studies show that the crowding conditions, of course, they're being fed all the wrong things, but the crowding conditions and the stress hormones are creating these protein structures in their tissue that cannot be broken down by cooking alone. And so when we ingest them, and we have endogenous, that means that inside of us, we make amyloids, and amyloids in their natural state are a balancing mechanism. They're homeostatic. They create a little bit of inflammation so the body can go, okay, I need to do something. And if our adrenals are working right, then it's going to do everything we need. And then we come back to balance. But when we hit a tipping point with these external amyloids, what we have found in the clinical research show, and our clinical outcomes prove, is that it's contributing to a reactivation of viral loads, of bacterial loads, of all these pathogens, which then trip the genes, which then create the symptomology. And here we go. We got this whole melee of bad boy things that we've just talked about. So I really encourage your listeners to go wild, that we found that undomesticated things that we really like, you don't have to go out and hunt it, but animals such as bison and elk and venison and New Zealand lamb, those types of wild boar, elk, that they contain a less of an amyloid burden. And when that happens, our amino acid utilization goes through the roof. And you know, Cynthia, that I work with some of the top athletes in the world, and we have really proven this. When we make them Wildatarian, their performance equally improves, and we're maximizing the human potential by adopting a Wildatarian approach and then matching that genetic blueprint to that current state of health. But proteins, I say chicken is the dirty bird. Just like we have killer kale, chicken is the dirty bird. It's an inflammatory omega-6. It's been linked to increasing E. coli, but it's the most studied in terms of the amyloid burden. We had a client who was a type 1 diabetic. He came to see me because he had osteomyelitis. That is a flesh-eating bacteria, actually bone-eating bacteria, that was and flesh-eating. So it was unrelenting. He'd been on 8 rounds of antibiotics, and there was nothing to be done. We found out that he had strep and candida, and he had a viral reactivation, which was being burdened by the foods he was eating. He was trying to eat a lot of chicken. It resolved within 8 weeks, and he had 1 meal of chicken. And we were able to lower his insulin in concert with the doctor by 90%. Insulin use by 90% lowered. And his blood sugar was from 400 to 120. He had 1 meal of chicken, and it increased by 200 points for 4 days. He thought it was an anomaly. He waited a month. He did it again. So chicken is really a dirty bird, and we have other options. And that is it's such a mainstay in our diet. And I'm telling you, folks, I have not had one piece of chicken in almost 5 years. And my muscle mass, my insulin regulation, my dad became a type 1 diabetic in adult life. My hemoglobin A1C, I just got it measured. It's 4.9. That's amazing. So eating and adapting a Wildatarian approach, I'm actually metabolically de-aging because my markers have improved, because I'm actually able to use those amino acids and my inflammatory markers are much better. It's a real thing.
And I think it's really important because my listeners are very familiar with Gabrielle Lyme's work, and it's overwhelming to them to consume that much protein because most, if not all, women are eating way too little amounts of protein.
Yes.
But explaining it that way, it almost sounds Darwinian that, these crowded conditions create these unhealthy birds, which we then consume, which we can't break down and assimilate the protein into the proper amino acid structure that we need for our bodies. So it's almost like we're, overfed, but undernourished. I mean, it's really kind of that's how I think about it. And much to your point, I think on many levels that when my family and I eat, when we're very conscientious about how we source our meat, and certainly now I think bison is even more popular in my house than beef is, and we are very a meat-centric family for sure. But it's interesting to me when I talk to people, and I said, when I went to Montana, we had elk, and people think that seems so strange. And I said, no, actually, we're in a part of the country where elk are indigenous, and we thought we would try it as a family. We'll try it all together. We started with elk sausage, and it wasn't gamey. I think that was my expectation, having had venison and finding venison very gamey. But the other piece that I want to tie into that is I'm someone who still is fat malabsorbed. So my body naturally gravitates toward lower fat meats. And so if my family of four sit down for a steak, 2 of us like filet, 2 will have ribeye, everyone's happy. Now, if the people who love ribeye eat filet, they'll eat it, but they don't enjoy it. However, if my older son and I try to sit down and have a ribeye, it's way too rich. I mean, to the point where I can't take more than a bite or two. And I find that fascinating that my body on its own will kind of identify that for me on a bio-individual level, my body can't properly break down those fats the way that maybe someone else's body will.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of the body talk, right? And you've become facile in body talk, right? So now you recognize, oh, I've had this oxalate. I had too much. I had a tipping point that I have plantar fasciitis, or I have a loose stool. I ate this fattier cut of meat. And now I'm feeling that fluffy fat metabolism impairment because you understand it. And so this is the power of the work of understanding my nature, and in a not in a static way, but in a dynamic way, right? And women who are cycling, we tell them, look, if you even have the little bit of fat metabolism impairment, 0 fat during your periods and your mid-cycle, because you're having a shift in hormones. You're going to be really estrogen dominant during that first 3 days before to the first 3 days after your period. And also when you ovulate, if you're progesterone deficient, you're still going to be estrogen dominant, as that progesterone is supposed to be coming up and estrogen is supposed to be coming down. So 0 to no fat. And we've had just tremendous success in that dance around, there are 28 to 30 something day cycle for women that are mensing. And so super important to know your body and know your genes and understand how food can be really a healer or a poison. And everywhere in between.
What is going on in the world right now? I know that you've been speaking out more about the concept of health sovereignty, why it's so important to be actively involved in our health and our wellness and communication with our healthcare team. What does that represent to you in this post-pandemic environment?
Really, health sovereignty is a term of art that I think was born through the pandemic. When at the beginning, we really lost our sovereignty. We lost our power to think for ourselves, to act for ourselves, to behave in community and engage in community. And as we have re-socialized over these last 4+ years, what's still missing is our health sovereignty. And I believe it's because fundamentally, the mechanisms of action in the body changed during the pandemic. And even skilled physicians, practitioners are still trying to untangle what those changes are. And so part of little did I know that over these 20 years of my working in this iterative applied kinesiology, which has become like a real-time lab for me, because we're seeing it changes in real time. Body intelligence is being shown to me through every client that walks through the door, is that there'd be such significant mechanisms of action where actually now histamine response can actually turn into type 1 diabetes or a heart attack or idiopathic anxiety. And that histamine is driven by the spike protein that turns on certain receptors. And so, or that, you're being hijacked with uterus, their growing cyst in a 23-year-old as big as cantaloupes, because the spike protein has hijacked GABA, which is necessary for follicular balance in the ovaries, and also GABA is there in the uterus and in the lining, the cervix, and so we can't treat things the way we treated them before. But if we understand and we start paying attention and start following and connecting the dots, I really believe we can get back to health sovereignty. And I'm becoming a very big disruptor in the space in terms of what does that mean and how do we claim it. First, we have to understand that we have to be our own advocate. And we have to have advocates for us listening when we've been given scary diagnoses, which are, falling down on people's hearts on the daily. 2 is we need to question everything. And 3 is start connecting new dots again. So really connect those new dots.
Yeah, and I think that it certainly has been my experience interviewing experts on the podcast over the last several years that there is greater concern for not just COVID or the pandemic or the virus or however we want to represent it, but you don't necessarily have to have received the vaccine to be impacted by these spike proteins. Can we speak to what the spike proteins represent and how, even if you haven't per se had the vaccine, that you can be impacted? Because I think this is quite significant. And I'm hearing this across different spectrums in physician friends, nurse practitioners, experts like yourself, researchers, that we haven't fully appreciated what this represents yet, that there's probably more to come than what we're aware of right now.
Absolutely. And so I coined it, you've been spiked. Okay. Through vaccine, through actually getting COVID itself, or being in the ethos of the spike protein, we are constantly trying to reestablish homeostasis within our body in a spike protein environment. And for me, I know I've been spiked when my blood sugar drops. So I I don't have one on now, but I wear a continuing glucose monitor pretty much all the time. My hemoglobin A1C is beautiful. It was 4.8 to 5.0. No problem with diabetes. But when I was being spiked, I would have a significant drop in blood sugar. And there's a reason for that. But that was my telltale sign. And so what's happened is, and I've done deep research on this, and again, because I feel like my clinic is a lab, I feel like I'm getting real time, every time feedback. And I feel like there have been many flavors of the spike protein with the various variances in the spike protein. Initially, what we saw was really a big hijacking of GABA, and I talked just to that. But generally what the spike protein does is it uses the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 to bring itself into the cells. But when that happens, there's a cascade effect that occurs. So angiotensin 2, ACE2, is responsible for what we know is angiotensin 1 through 7. When that's in play, everything is happy. We have fluid balance, we have insulin balance, we have follicular balance, we have anti-apoptosis. But what that mechanism of action does, it gets shut down, and now you have angiotensin 2, not angiotensin converting enzyme 2, but angiotensin 2 is in play. And then what happens? Fibrogenicity, insulin dysregulation. We have the follicular development being hijacked. Why? Because ACE is responsible for GABA, and GABA is responsible for insulin regulation, fluid balance. It's responsible for the central nervous system. We're seeing a lot of dysautonomia. So when GABA gets hijacked, that's what happens. So that was the first flavor of COVID. And then we had what I called COVID GI. So then the next variants of COVID, spike protein, dysregulated L-tyrosine in the gut, lactobacillus in the gut. It created a histamine receptor, which was then increasing our hydrogen sulfide, which was causing what was deemed to be small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but it wasn't necessarily the bacteria, it was hydrogen sulfide, setting off a sulfur histamine cascade. And then we've had, so I call it COVID psychosis, COVID endocrine, COVID nervous system because of the amyloids. Oh my goodness, Cynthia, I've been preaching about amyloids for over 8 years. I feel like I almost wrote the Wildatarian book in advance of COVID, because what I have now learned and proven is that the 4 disruptors of protein, fat, sulfur, and oxalate, the spike protein does the exact same thing. I've deemed it the disrupted mirror effect. And so this disrupted mirror effect, why? Because COVID initiates 7 vectors of amyloidogenesis. What does amyloid do? We have Alzheimer's, dementia, ALS. We just have a friend of mine in our community. They just pulled the plug on his friend at 52 with ALS. Alzheimer's is now the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. That was within the last 4 years, but it's not even taking the effects of the pandemic. So amyloids are a big deal, and amyloids are responsible for, which I've also been preaching, the reactivation of viral loads. The Epstein-Barr virus, the cytomegalovirus, the herpes virus, and the varicella virus is on fire, It's all in the clinical literature. So if you're eating an amyloid-burdened food supply and you've been on this planet, you have to be very careful. And now I'm unilaterally, unequivocally saying, if you're eating an amyloid-rich food supply, you are shortening your life. It's that severe.
So for the benefit of listeners that may not be familiarized with your work, or perhaps have missed our first 2 podcasts together, what are those amyloid-rich foods that you are speaking to?
So I have deemed chicken to be the dirty bird. So generally what has happened is that through industrialized farming, through the crowding condition of animals, through the mistreatment of animals, through the antibiotics and the pesticides and the food supply that they are eating, they started creating within their tissue, which is indestructible by food, by any kind of cooking supply, these amyloids. Amyloids are truncated protein structures that are indigestible. And research shows that amyloids, once consumed, cannot be broken down, or very difficult to be broken down. And then what they do is they'll go and gather in specific tissue. It's tissue specific, such as diabetes. It's systemic, such as lymphoma. I cannot tell you cancer is up 4,000%. I've never seen so much cancer in my practice as I have in the last specifically year. And so it harbors there. And not only does it land in the tissues, it's responsible for reactivating the viruses that have lived within us for many years. Most of us, if we've again lived on this planet, we are exposed to Epstein-Barr, that was mononucleosis, varicella, that's chickenpox, cytomegalo, which is the other side of mononucleosis, the HSV 126. So most of us have been exposed, yet these viruses live commensally within us. Only 43% of us are our own cells. The rest are not our cells. It's virus, pathogens, fungi, parasites. So to think we can kill them, well, it's not realistic, but we have to, what I say is, have everybody have a seat at the UN. You get 1 vote and everybody's living happily instead of becoming bullies in the sandbox. But this food supply, so 8 years ago, I was really speaking to this epidemic of autoimmunity, which back then 1 in 14 was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. And these autoimmune diseases were really, I believe, in large part, being contributed or being exacerbated by these viruses that had been reactivated in large part by amyloids and mycotoxins, which is also part of the pandemic picture, because mycotoxins build biofilm, and biofilm feeds amyloids. And then the amyloids feed biofilm, which then creates a pathogenic storm within our body. So 8 years ago, I started saying, please be aware of amyloid-rich foods. They're going to contribute to autoimmunity, to chronic illness, and so forth. And Cynthia, 90% of the $4.5 trillion budget that we have for health is in chronic conditions. They're related to chronic conditions. And every chronic condition in the US is a metabolic disease. That means that it is driven by the food we eat, what we put in, on, or around us.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, certainly when I trained back in the 1990s, there was little to no discussion around food. We were back during the food guide pyramid. This preceded my plate.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely having a child that had life-threatening food allergies caused me to start thinking about food differently before most of my other traditionally trained allopathic peers. And what I've come to find is that if 70% of us in the United States are eating ultra processed foods every day, we are exposed to toxins at a level that we have never experienced before. And so I think a lot of what you're speaking to is it's a byproduct of our modern day lifestyles that is kind of creating this perfect storm for all this poor metabolic health. And the autoimmunity, the higher rates of cancer, the infertility concerns. Now, I would love to speak to not just amyloids, but when we talk about mold and mycotoxins, I feel like for a lot of people, it seems incredibly intangible. They're like, sometimes there's mold in my shower. We know that 25% of us are at greater risk for susceptibility to mold or mycotoxins just based on our genetic patterning. And so when you're talking to your clients about mold, what are some of the big picture things you speak to them about to kind of make them be more attuned to their environment, and whether it's home or work or when they travel, which I know probably for all of us when we travel, we're really at the mercy of where we're staying. We may have zero control over the moldy environment in a hotel, as an example.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So once again, the food supply, really bred by industrialized farming. When you think of corn and soy being our number 1 and 2 crops produced in the United States, and 90% of them are genetically modified, on corn grows a very, very toxic mold substance. So Michael Pollan long ago made the quote, "We're a bunch of walking corn sticks," because corn is everywhere. I slightly adapted it to say we're a bunch of walking mold sticks because if you're eating corn, you're eating mold. And what's been very interesting over the course of, again, industrialized farming is that with the advent of glyphosate, which over 280 million pounds of glyphosates are sprayed in the US crops annually, and 100 countries are still using glyphosate. Glyphosate has been, I believe that between amyloids and glyphosate, those are the 2 most destructive implications to our health paradigm. And that's why, back to health sovereignty, if we're informed, we can move and navigate around it even in this pandemic. And so why is glyphosate correlated to mold? Well, glyphosate inhibits the production of the oxalobacter bacteria, which is responsible for breaking down oxalates in our system. And oxalates and aspergillus and mold, they play together, they intersect. And guess what the spike protein does? It increases the oxalate burden by drawing calcium. So I call oxalates glass shards. So now oxalates are feeding the mold burden, and the mold burden is feeding oxalates and mycotoxins, mold and mycotoxins and fungi. I look at them very similarly in the same family because they have biofilm. And so we are now plagued with lack of oxalobacteria in our bodies that don't help us form what is necessary to break down that oxalate burden. We are walking mold sticks. 25% of the sugar we consume is in liquid form. Sugar is going to feed the mold burden. Mold has been encased in our tight homes because it's not breathing. Plastics, anything that's sealed is going to ferment. So we're living in a very high mold environment. Plus the climate has changed. The temperatures, I work with NASA, and so temperatures have risen faster than we have noted. And so mold in the environment is ever growing. And so we are effectively living in a spore environment. Now, when we are in balance with ourselves, we can manage that because the body is constantly doing karate chops on things that are out of balance. But mold is very, very important to understand because it ties back to oxalates. Because the mold creates the biofilm will feed the amyloid burden. And then I call it the ping pong effect. And then that amyloid will feed back to the mold. Why is mold so important in terms of managing it? Because it has to do with mental health, and particularly autism. When you think about, I think the latest statistics now say that 1 in 33 boys are autistic. When you look at and the work of Yashko, who was one of the leaders in autism, she long ago said it's tied to an oxalate burden because oxalates disrupt dopamine and serotonin, which the majority of those two neurotransmitters are made in our GI tract. So how do we manage it? We have to be aware of what are oxalate-rich foods. We have to be aware of what is our environment. We have to breathe. We have to use modulators, not killers. Again, if we try to kill, it again disrupts the terrain within us because we have bacteria all in, on, and around us as well. So we have to be modulating it instead of trying to completely eradicate. And so prebiotics that are natural, like artichoke, that aren't any of the saccharides, right? Any of the sugars are not, I don't believe are good. I don't like inulin as a prebiotic, but I love artichoke. I love asparagus. And so those prebiotics that help us reestablish the probiotics in the gut, because another thing that we have found through this pandemic, Cynthia, with the turning on the histamine receptor gene, probiotics tend to be high histamine. And so if we're consuming oral probiotics, we're going to increase our histamine load, which then flips the sulfur, which is tied to oxalate at the genetic level. And so these big four, once again, the disrupted mirror effect is exacerbating what we are already having strains on our body before the pandemic.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I first learned about oxalates through our work together. And, after my hospitalization 5 years ago and 6 weeks of antibiotics, antifungals, and I kept having persistent gut issues, even though I was full carnivore at that time. And I think I mentioned to you that I was eating almond flour crackers. And it was like a light bulb went off, and you said, I think you probably have an oxalate sensitivity. And so for anyone listening that's trying to figure out, because these are a constellation of different symptoms that can come together. And if you're working with a traditionally trained provider, they may not even be putting these pieces together. So when people come to you, let's speak to middle-aged women, because that's who the preponderance of our listeners are. What are some of the signs for you when you're working with someone, whether it's an established patient or someone that's new? What are some of the signs that tip off for you that there is this, as you mentioned, the disrupted mirror effect is magnifying the symptoms they're experiencing?
Oxalates, particularly for middle-aged women, are a big deal. Why is that? As we once again shift our beautiful internal rhythm, as we move into menopause and perimenopause, or perimenopause and menopause, the first hormone to fall is progesterone, and progesterone is necessary actually for adrenal balancing because adrenals will shift cortisol. Cortisol is a sugar. It's a stress hormone, cortisol and adrenaline. I call it the dirty cupcake because it's both a fat and a sugar. And so as progesterone falls, even though our estrogen numbers are also falling, progesterone is falling precipitously first. So we become estrogen dominant. What does estrogen do? It feeds mold, and mold feeds estrogen, and estrogen feeds histamine, and estrogen will increase serotonin so we can become hyper anxious. And so when I have somebody that comes in that is feeling brain fog, that they're actually having cystic acne as a 40-something-year-old, that they're becoming fluffy, that they are becoming their GI is becoming bloated, that there's edema, I look to the oxalate burden, the mold burden, the candida. Candida will also interrupt the conversion of T4, which is one of our thyroid hormones, to T3. So you will not be metabolically robust. So we really have to watch anything that will feed that candida burden. And it's bi-directional. Candida feeds mold, mold feeds candida, candida trips your thyroid, candida is going to hit your ovaries and create cysts, estrogen growth, and estrogen is a cell proliferator. And by the way, here we go again, the disrupted mirror effect. Because GABA has been hijacked, GABA was necessary for the making of estradiol, which is our happy, protective estrogen. So when that goes down, as you know, there's three types of estrogen. So when estradiol goes down, now estrone goes up. So estrone is the bad boy. And so women are coming in and they're getting microcysts in their breast. If they're lucky, I'm seeing going from 0 to 3rd stage metastasized breast cancer over and over and over again. And so, or ovarian cyst, or ovarian cancer, or uterine cancer, or dysplasia. And so we really have to look at those mycotoxins, that mold, those oxalates that are healthy for us, but are no longer right for us. They used to be healthy. I call them the right wrong foods. And so I really look to being extremely careful with women relative to that oxalate burden, the hijacking of GABA, the estrogen overload, which then disrupts metabolic function. And also it disrupts, because back to the gut, the serotonin and the dopamine, which then people become depressed, anxious, so forth. And they're put on antidepressants, and they really need to be managing their candida and managing that estrogen burden and supporting with GABA, unless you have a GAD gene, which then GABA can convert to glutamate, but then even then you pulse GABA. So I know I'm getting very biochemically technical here, but it's really important to know these nuances, because I believe that we, even in this really uncertain time with all these hijacking of our mechanisms of action, if we're empowered and we have knowledge, we don't have to be afraid. We just have to move in the right direction to know that we can pretty much resolve anything, because the body is so brilliant.
Well, it's so interesting to me because, putting these little pieces together, as you mentioned, the right, wrong foods. What do you find are the most common right, wrong foods that most of your, let's just, again, we'll think about the middle-aged woman corundum. Most of those women are eating unknowingly that are exacerbating or contributing to these symptoms. I will say, before I let you answer that, for me, fermented foods, there's a happy balance, and I was overdoing it, and that tripped off the histamine, which then I developed in the midst of a book launch, developed hives, which I'd never experienced before. So it is a real phenomenon. This is a real thing.
It's a real thing. So what are women told to do, especially in middle age? Build muscle. And what do we do to build muscle? We take a lot of protein powders in. Pea proteins contain mycotoxins. There was just a study that came out that 75% of pea protein actually had heavy metals, and over 58% had mycotoxins and lead. So if we're eating pea protein to try to gain that muscle during perimenopause and menopause, that is no bueno. Also, mycotoxins will build mold. So pea protein is off the table. No way to pea protein. Another one that's very, very interesting, which we've been told that we need to take as an antioxidant, is turmeric. You know, drink that golden tea. No, it's an oxalate. And so that's really key. And then another thing that we really need to think about is, am I supplementing with the right probiotics? Should I be taking probiotics, or should I let my food be my prebiotic and very gentle probiotic? And so again, those fermented foods, you know, the macrobiotic diet way back when, before we really messed up our environment. And I really believe this, we turned the tide to a tsunami starting 8 years ago, when I believe we just had a tipping point on the glyphosate and the industrialized farming, and we just crossed over. My first book, Cynthia, was full of oxalates and sulfur, right? And chicken and beef, because we had not turned that tide. That was written over a decade ago. Now it's no. And again, building back to protein, you know, we've been told eat 100 grams of protein a day. You have to know your protein sources. It has to be clean. It has to be low amyloid. I'm a proponent of wild. I'm an example of wild. You know my age, and I don't do steroids, hormones. I don't even do hormone therapy. I just do wild. And it might, because even absent the amyloid burden, when we eat wild game, we are increasing our omega-3 fatty acids and decreasing our omega-6 fatty acids. There's been a really big push against seed oils. I agree, they're destructive. And they're found in our animals and the animal meat, because when we feed them corn, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 goes up. A happy bison has more omega-3s than a farm-raised salmon. So meat isn't bad. It's just how we've grown our meat. And if we're eating industrial or raised farm chicken, beef, pork, or turkey, those are the non-wilds, you're effectively feeding not only an amyloid burden, but you're feeding an omega-6 burden, which is going to affect everything, the cell membrane structure, our brain, diabetes, which is, I believe, you know, insulin, and Mercola is really big on this, is like the insulin. He's big on seed oils, as is Dave Asprey. It just stabilizes insulin, which again, the mirror effect destabilizes it as well, because the pandemic has really affected insulin, as did our protein affecting insulin metabolism, because when you can't break down our proteins, amino acid utilization as it turns to glycolysis, which is how we manage sugar, is disrupted.
Now, I know one of the questions, if people are tuning into this podcast, they're thinking, what about pasture raised animals, or grass-fed beef, or pastured chicken? Are those still a no? Or do you feel like there has been an evolution in the quality there versus kind of food lot meat?
It's clearly better. However, know your farmer, because certain organizations have allowed definitions to be very diluted. So a pasture-fed chicken could mean that 5 seconds of its life, it was on a 2x4 piece of grass, and then it went back into its cage. And so for beef, regeneratively farmed animals are, I believe, almost as clean as wild. And again, if we start feeding the wild animals the way we fed the domesticated animals, we're going to be in the same soup down the road. So regenerative, then pasture fed, pasture finished, because if it's pasture fed, they can finish with corn. So there goes that omega-6 instead of that omega-3, which is deleterious. And again, you don't know how long they were on that pasture and how much did they have to crowd, right? So know your farmers. I always talk to farmers at farmers markets. I think they're really honest. You know, somebody told me last week, I said, do you spray your crops? Not about animals, but well, ma'am, I have to make a living. So I just said, thank you for your, thank you for your transparency. And I walked away. Others are like, are you organic? No, but we do everything organic standard. We just haven't been certified because we don't have the funding to do so. So it's really, really understanding where your food's coming from. Now you're not going to be able to talk to your farmers every week, right? But once you understand the sources and you can really find goods. Broken Arrow is a great source. Wild Fork, they have Thrive, Vital Choice, I believe, for seafood. There are ways, and I have no affiliation with any of these companies, but I really enjoy them. There are places to find better sources for sure.
Yeah, there are some great farmers markets in Northern Virginia. I miss those quite a bit. It's a little more conservative down here, and like they have their farmers market on like a Tuesday from 10 to 2, and that's not always conducive with being able to get over to there. Now, if someone's listening and they're trying to navigate making better choices, maybe it's a mom with younger kids, and certainly I'm at the stage of life where my teenagers eat 2 meals for every meal because they're growing and they're very lean and athletic. Are there proteins that you feel like are more economical but can still embrace that kind of wildatarian philosophy?
That is a great question. So one of the things that I espouse is food combining, and not the traditional definition of food combining. So let's assume that your ground bison is going to cost you $9.99 a pound. Okay. What I do is I'll take certain beans that are not fermentable, that are low mycotoxic, that don't have oxalates. So white beans actually help with T cell. So I'll take a ground bison and I'll add beans. I just made this week a ground wild boar barbecue that I had the Great Northern beans. I had tomatoes in there, zucchini in there. And so what you do is you really stretch, your price per pound. And by adding the beans, you're getting not a complete protein, but you're also getting protein. And then if you do, the complementary amino acids, you're going to still get those high protein amounts. So that is an amazing way to stretch your food dollar. Another way is to, back to community experience, is to share half a bison with someone. The price per pound goes way down. If you have 4 families sharing half a bison or a quarter bison, you can really find some economical ways to do that, and it becomes even cheaper than beef at some points.
Yeah, I think it's there's so many creative ways. When people ask those kinds of questions, I always look at it as a challenge. Like, certainly we have a friend, a mutual friend that lives locally, and they have several head of cattle on their property. And when they go to process, as they call it, they process the animal, they'll oftentimes give us a portion. And I was telling my husband, it's unbelievable how much meat even you get from a quarter of an animal. And so I think that's a really great way. And then you get creative because then you have cuts of meat maybe you've never worked with before. And it forces you to be creative and think outside the box beyond like ground meat and sirloin and maybe a fillet. And I think that that's, certainly good on the learning curve. Now, one of the most common challenges that I find in women in middle age is dealing with weight loss resistance. And I know you talk about the dirty cupcake. I know you talk around this quite a bit, but I think it's a point worth revisiting because so many women, even women that are doing a lot of the right things, are so impacted as they navigate early perimenopause into late perimenopause and then eventually into postmenopause.
So weight loss resistance is a really big deal. 42% of the US population is considered obese. 42% of the US population is carrying 2 or more chronic conditions. So we're in a health crisis, and it's only going to be exacerbated. And what I will say is that the obesity is linked in ways that we've never looked at it before. Okay. It's not just about the sugar. I'm going to go into some things that I feel are very misunderstood or not understood at all. Again, back to that amino acid utilization. If you're eating the wrong proteins, you will not break down those proteins into amino acids. It takes 5,300 amino acids to make one strand of muscle fiber. That means that your body has to take in that protein, it has to disassemble it and reassemble it into a very perfect chain of 5,300 amino acids so it can make one strand of muscle fiber. If not, it's going to fat. So consuming the right proteins. Now, insulin resistance has become a huge deal, but the pandemic changed the mechanisms of action. So you could be insulin resistant because you have an iron overload. So this is really novel. What's happening, what I'm seeing with women, even vegetarian women are having iron overloads. Why? The pandemic turned on the hemochromatosis gene. It has turned on iron. Not only did it turn on those receptors, we over zinced because we were told that's the way to bind the spike protein. Zinc is an antagonist to copper, which modulates iron. And so what I'm telling women that are having problems with weight loss resistance, check your iron. We're telling women to phlebotomize quarterly.
Wow.
Because iron burden is through the roof. And I'm asking women as part of their checkups, ask for your iron, your ferritin, your TIBC. You're going to find, for the first time in my life, I had a high iron. I used to be always generally on that anemic side. Why is that important? Because iron converts to amyloids. Iron becomes oxidated and it competes with mitochondrial function, which is cellular function, which is metabolic function, which goes to weight. So you could be insulin resistant and weight resistance because of iron, because of histamine. Histamine's been tied to insulin resistance. Cholesterol. So what's happening is histamine is competing with the LDL receptor. So we're seeing people with LDL cholesterol going through the roof. We need cholesterol as women because it's a backbone of hormones, but when it's oxidated because of what's happening, the iron, the histamine, the amyloids, you're going to get weight resistance. And a statin isn't going to help you. You may need an antihistamine. You may need to lower your iron loads. You may need a little bit of bioavailable copper to manage that iron burden. You certainly need a low amyloid form of food to increase your amino acid utilization. That's there. And then you have the stress response, right? So stress, as you've noted, I call the dirty cupcake. Cortisol and adrenaline is the dirty cupcake. It is a hormone and it's a sugar. And what happens is when we become stressed, our body just thinks it had or ate a dirty cupcake. So the body responds with an insulin response. Insulin is called the fat storage hormone. Insulin not used is stored. It's stored right around our middle. So stress can make us bigger. Stress can feed that candida to lead to estrogen dominance, to manage thyroid dysfunction, to make us bigger. Stress can disrupt our lymphatic system because the second role of lymph is fat metabolism. So when you're over secreting insulin, you're gonna get fluffy and swell. There are many reasons why there's a lot of weight resistance in this country. Sometimes, and you're an expert on this, and we've talked about this offline at depth, women need to intermittent fast very differently than men. If your window is too big, if you're in a certain part of your cycle, you may be going hypoglycemic, causing the dirty cupcake effect, because on the other end, if you're going hypoglycemic, your body's going to respond with cortisol or adrenaline to manage that blood sugar. So you've dirty cupcaked yourself on the back end.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I love that you're introducing some new connections that I would not have made. I do iron panels on everyone. And I'm oftentimes amazed at the extremes, people that are just chronically low iron and low ferritin, and then people who are on the other end. And I saw a lot of hemochromatosis in cardiology, and we would send patients for therapeutic um, removal of the blood. So it's interesting. They can be phlebotomized every 3 to 4 months, depending on the individual, and they're very likely also seeing a hematologist at the same time just to cover our tracks. I think it's so interesting how much fasting can be both a strategy, but it can also be detrimental. And what I'm starting to see, and it's why I've started speaking more openly about this problem, as an example, people that overfast, they become weight loss resistant. And so they think less food, more restriction, more exercise. And we talk about that stress piece that becomes hugely problematic for women. And I always say lovingly, we become less stress resilient. But
Yes.
there's a reason mechanistically this is happening. And so if you're doing OMAD habitually and chronically, if you're doing these crazy 36, 48, 6 day fasts, I tell everyone, if you understand mechanistically what's happening, if you're already someone that's on the thinner side, we don't want to lose muscle. We want to be conscientious about it. Do you sometimes work with women that are at extremes? So they're have a strong desire to lose weight, but they're putting things in their path that are compromising their ability to lose weight, like the over restriction of food, the negative, pervasive thoughts. What do you typically do with women like this? I seem to be finding more of them, or they seem to be coming into my world, and I'm referring them out to specialists because I feel like it is a bigger problem than what I like to handle within my business.
That's a really good question. And yes, I do work with a lot of that. And part of this is really, and being, I believe, an expert practitioner, is you have to also speak to the psychology of the individual, the emotional state of the individual. And so with these women, what I try to start having them adapt is to move away slowly from an all or nothing into a something sometimes, and to move away from absolutes and labels. This is a naughty food. This is a bad food. This is a good food. This is, and so we're what in the psychology is, this isn't a match for me right now. And our practice, Cynthia, what we do when we give food lists to people, we say yes, but we never say no. We leave it blank. If it's just not now, it's a blank because we're leaving it open to the time where it will be a yes, or a limit, or a sometimes, or during this time. So the psychology is critical because, and I work in a lot of energy as well in quantum physics, and the thought creates the thing. If it, oh my gosh, I have to restrict my eating or I'm going to be bigger. Well, that's what's going to happen. You're going to be bigger because the body and the neuro linguistic programming, what it hears is, I'm going to be bigger. And so we really have to understand, and I work with clients at a very granular level, and the mind is so critical. Start with the mind. If the mind is not in a way that is open to giving itself compassion, to saying, how is it best for me? Not my neighbor, not my sister, not my best friend, but for me. And not to get caught in the dogma of these vast waves of what's hot at the moment, right? Kale used to be terrible. The biggest thing on the planet. I deemed it killer kale years ago. Now kale, all of a sudden people are saying, well, let's not eat kale. It's a sponge for pesticides. For me, it's just all for an oxalate. But so we have these waves of what's in vogue, but we have to get back to what's right for me and what's right for me right now. And so the underpinning of the way that I look at the world right now from a metabolic and from a health perspective is matching your genetic blueprint to your current state of health, which is dynamic. It will change. And so your needs will change.
I love your perspective. It's always so well grounded and thoughtful and elevated. I would love to kind of end the conversation today talking about do you have any things that you're interested in or trends that you see coming or things that, whether it's a supplement, a food, things that you are just more interested in, more vested in working more with? Because most of the time when individuals are listening to this podcast, they're like, what's the hot new supplement or what's the hot new food or what are what's the research that's causing you to stop and think like, oh, this might be something that is changing the narrative with my given patient population?
So one of the things that I'm really excited about is the technology of what's in the longevity space, right? Very small embryonic-like stem cells. Now, I call it the Tesla model. Right now, it's not available to the general public because it is so expensive, but I believe over time it will be democratized. I love the V cells because they're 100% matched. They're your own, and they have never been turned on. This is the genius work of Dr. Todd Ovakaitis, who's now speaking globally on this. I've been the beneficiary of the stem cells. His average stem cells over 6 months will reduce your biological age by an average of 4 to 6 years. So it's really remarkable. So stem cells are a big thing, but something simpler, okay? Really the lymph has become such a big deal in terms of weight resistance, in terms of fluffiness, in terms of brain fog, in terms of metabolic health, just because of the debris that lymph carries. And so there's a guasha stone that you just, use on the daily. And I will tell you, for me personally, it has been a game changer in terms of even bringing in more musculature, smoothing out, the face, because we hold lymph and we hold fluffiness. I really love that. From a supplemental perspective, so methylene blue was the very first FDA approved drug, and then it became over the counter. I'm hoping that it stays over the counter. Why is methylene blue so important? One, it's a broad spectrum antiviral. It's also a neurotropic though. And so it's being even considered to be used in lieu of SSRIs. It is serotonergic, and it really helps to uplift the body in terms of what is important during the day for metabolic resilience. Serotonin spikes in the morning. We need high serotonin in the morning. We need melatonin at night so we can convert that serotonin to melatonin. Don't take serotonin at night. It'll be harder to convert. But what I love about that is it's, especially in this pandemic, again, making no claims, but it's broad spectrum anti-pathogenic. And it's just done amazing studies. There's a lot of work with that. Vitamin C in coffee used with methylene blue seems to be more effective. I love that product. And then one of the ones which I really love, which is brand new in the market that I'm using in very different ways. I don't want to give away too much, but there's something called HelioCare, and this is it's called Fern Block, which is the registered trademark, and it is important to manage the melanocytes of the body. And so because what this does is we are now knowing that, hey guys, the technology of the future, like the stem cells, and then the wisdom of the past is get back into the sun. Sunblock wasn't our thing. It's toxic in many ways. Get back into the sun in the morning to get that UVB and UVA rays, because we need it not only for vitamin D and waking up, but actually if you allow your gut to be exposed, you're actually repopulating your microbiota. But we don't want to get sunburned, because sunburn induces histamine, and then histamine creates that cascade that we just talked about, which will make you diabetic and heavy, believe it or not. So I love this because it increases your melanocytes, where you can go out and you actually don't burn. Now, I just went to Florida and I did not wear suntan lotion, and my whole family got burnt and I didn't. I love it. And it really is just incredibly powerful. It reduces oxidative stress. It helps to increase the melanocytes. It helps you take on the sun with less impact. I don't want to say without impact, but with less impact. And we need our sun.
Well, I always enjoy our conversations so much. Please let listeners know how to connect with you, how to work with you, how to get access to your book, Wildatarian, which I love and have in my library.
Thank you. Well, I'm all over social media, Teri Cochrane Beyond Nutrition on Instagram. We've got TikTok, we've got Facebook. TeriCochrane.com is my website. There are my proprietary supplements are sold there. Wildatarian, Diet Living as Nature Intended on Amazon. So we're always here to continue being a disruptor in the space and always sharing that even in the space of confusion, truth is always truth. And so it's just that it changes as what is the aperture of the truth that I can see now that is different than I saw even a week ago, because things are ever unfolding.
Well, thank you again for your contributions.
Thank you, my friend.
Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
We make almost all of our fat cells during childhood and puberty. And then once we finish puberty, we're done. That number of fat cells, in most people, there are some people who are an exception to this, and that's about 15% of people who are in the obese category. But most people reach a limit, and that's their fat cell number essentially for adulthood.